We're continuing with our sermon series on Advent, and this second week of the Advent season is traditionally the week of peace, and that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be in John chapter 16, starting in verse 33, and ending in verse 33. We're going to cover verse 33, and we're going to talk about peace today. And as we're talking about peace, it's going to be important to bear in mind a few things that we're going to cover. One is, what kind of peace are we talking about? Because one of the things that is troublesome to us in our modern culture is that there are a lot of different ways of looking at peace. There are a lot of different definitions of peace. It's important to understand it from a biblical perspective. The second thing we're going to talk about is the need for storms. And then finally, we're going to talk about the path of peace. So let's go ahead and start today in John chapter 16, verse 33. Jesus says, "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Now, this is a pretty concise encapsulation of what Jesus has been talking about in chapter 33. And it's interesting from the standpoint of Jesus basically says, you're going to have a lot of hardships, you're going to have a lot of troubles. First of all, I'm leaving you, which obviously if you're one of the disciples, that's not good news. But secondly, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You're going to face hardships. You're going to have suffering that you're going to have to contend with. And then he says, "I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace." And that doesn't sound very, very peaceful. And then he says, "In the world you will have tribulation." Again, that's not very peaceful. "But take heart, I have overcome the world." Now, the thing that we need to understand when we look at Jesus and as he speaks of peace, we need to understand what kind of peace. So let's look at that firstly. What kind of peace is Jesus talking about? There's a lot of modern conceptions of peace. In fact, you can find them all over the place. I know somebody who makes a living trying to bring people peace in by doing nidras and things like that, chants, and trying to get people to experience peace in darkened rooms and soft music and those kinds of things. And in fact, if you look at what's kind of popular online, is you'll see a lot of people doing yoga, but you can't just do yoga, you have to go to some peaceful location. You go to a beach where there's gentle waves rolling in, or maybe by a gentle stream, and you do yoga there, and then you'll have peace. And that's generally, I think, what most people think of when they think of peace, is maybe being out camping or being away from all the difficulties of life. But fascinating as that is, it really doesn't match up very well with the biblical or cultural definitions of peace. In fact, if you look at the word that's used here in this passage for peace, you see some of these same ideas, but it's interesting the way that it changes when Christianity gets a hold of it. So when you look at the Greek word here, it was used in the Greek language and in the Greek culture of a state of national tranquility. So that's kind of like national peace. Your country's not at war. Well, that's a good thing. Exemption from the rage and havoc of war. You're experiencing peace because you don't have the rage and havoc of war, which was pretty common at the time. You have peace between individuals. You have a neighbor and you get along. You have security, safety, prosperity, felicity. Those are the kinds of the ways that this word was used. And those ways in the Greek language and culture before Christianity gets a hold of the word are very similar to the way that we would use the word. The problem is that when you look at the biblical characters and you look at their lives, it's hard to understand how peace really fits in. As an example, you have David. Remember, David had a really difficult life that had very little peace in it at all. He starts off and he's a shepherd, and you think, okay, that's tranquil. If you think that being a shepherd is tranquil, you've never dealt with sheep before. I remember I was just talking about in our Sunday school class, there was a documentary on, and this guy was a shepherd, and the sheep, they don't know anything. They don't even know how to keep themselves out of trouble. And so every moment of the day he was having to deal with them, and he was just getting more and more angry and frustrated the whole time. Not tranquil at all. David's life was similar to that in the fact that he was taking care of sheep and dealing with those things, but he was also taking care of wild animals and all the threats to the sheep. He goes from that to being, remember, in Saul's house, and Saul kind of loved him until he didn't love him anymore, and then he tries to kill him, and David gets anointed as king but has to flee, and there's Saul coming after him. And when you read about David in Sunday school, or you get taught David in Sunday school, you remember that Saul ends up getting killed in battle and David becomes king. But if you actually read the story, that's not what happens. There's a civil war after Saul dies. There's a civil war that goes on for years. And then David becomes king, and he has wars to fight against his enemies. And then what happens is one of his children turn against him, and he has an uprising in the kingdom. And in fact, almost at every moment of David's life, you have just a whirlwind around him. And you think, well, that's David, that's the Old Testament. I want to introduce you to a guy named Paul. You might have heard of him. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 24, it says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1. That's 200 lashes less 5. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Now, none of those seem to fit. I don't picture Paul doing yoga in the midst of these things while he was adrift at sea. Paul's life doesn't sound very peaceful. And so it's interesting that Christ brings us peace with God, and yet you look at Paul's life and it seems like the antithesis of peace. And so what's really fascinating here is that there's a change that takes place in the definition of peace. In the resource that I was looking at for the definition of the word that's used here, the Greek word for peace, it says, definition 5 of Christianity: the tranquil state of a soul assured of its salvation through Christ, and so fearing nothing from God, and content with its earthly lot, of whatsoever sort that is. Do you see the change there? You see, one kind of peace has to do with what's going on around you, and the other kind of peace has to do with what's going on inside of you. The thing is, you can't do a lot about many of the things that are going on around you. The thing is, the storm's going to rage around you. The tempest is going to swirl around you. There's so many times in your life that you can't do anything about what's going on around you. But see, if you have peace with God, then you can rest assured that whatever's happening is within God's hands, and that God, because of His love for you and because of the peace you have, none of that is meant for your ill, but only for your good. It's so interesting to see that Jesus becomes, of course, the perfect example of this. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 24, there's this passage where Jesus is out on the boat with His disciples. And remember that a lot of His disciples were professional fishermen. They knew their way around a boat. And He's out there, and in verse 24 it says, "And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But He was asleep." I've only known one person in my life that could sleep through something like that. He's not here today. But Jesus' ability to sleep in this storm has nothing to do with any physical gifts or talents that He has. It's not a physical state that allows Jesus to sleep through the storm. Imagine being in a small boat in a situation where the storm is so bad that the boat is being swamped, it's starting to sink, and in the midst of all the wind and the rain and the water and the waves coming over the side of the boat, that you could be asleep in that. How is it that Jesus can sleep in that? Because he has nothing to fear. You see, the question ultimately is this: who is it that holds your future? Or what is it that holds your future? You see, the problem is that for most of us, we go through life worshiping the wrong gods. And this has actually everything to do with the gods that you worship, even though you might not see it at the source or on the surface. Now, in the ancient world, you have all kinds of gods, and we see that as being kind of fundamentally ignorant, simple. We see the ancient people because they worshipped rivers, and they worshipped storm gods, and they worshipped mountain gods, and they worshipped all these gods of all these things. We look at that and we say, well, how naive and foolish they were. I don't think that they were naive and foolish. I think that they were just a little bit more honest than we are. Why is it that they worshiped a storm god? Because we worship storm gods. And they worship storm gods for the same reason we do. I've told you guys about being over the Gulf of Thailand in a 747 when all of a sudden a storm hit and we started to fall out of the sky. And there were stewardesses that were screaming. I'm generally okay with flying, but when the stewardesses start to panic, that's when I take my cue that it's time for me to panic. And the funny thing is, I didn't scream, but it wasn't because of my courage. It's because no sound would come out of my mouth. I had a death grip on the seat in front of me, and my mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. And people were crying. It was the worst thing that I had been a part of. It was the scariest, most terrifying thing. And the reason is because I worship the storm god just like the people around me. You see, why was I so terrified? Because I thought that my future was in the hands of the storm. And so did everybody around me. We were nothing but ancient storm god worshipers in that moment. You see, your God is the thing that you trust in. That is your God. Everybody has one. Your God is the thing that you trust in. Whatever thing you think your future is in its hands, that's your God. And so if you think that your future is in the hands of the storm, then you're going to have fear when the storm comes. If you think your future is in the hands of the stock market, that is your God. You see, part of the thing that's interesting about us is we have the wrong image of God, and we do so because we're modern people and we don't really understand things very well. All through the Old Testament, God talks about fearing Him, and we say, well, that's the Old Testament God. The New Testament God wants us to love. They're two sides of the same coin. Why is the Old Testament God talking about fearing Him? Because the person that you fear is your God. The thing that you think has ultimate power over your future, the thing that you think can make you live or die, the thing that you think is ultimately behind that, that's your God. Why is it that Jesus can sleep in the storm? Because his God is not the storm. It's his Father in heaven. And he knows his future is not in the hands of the storm, but in the hands of God. The question really is, does the storm determine your future? Does the harvest determine your future? Does the stock market determine your future? Does the state of war or peace in the world, does that determine your future? Who is your God? Who is your God? And you answer that actually every day through your anxiety. We answer who our God is every day through our anxiety. Now we have to understand that God will allow storms to come, and so we need to, secondly, understand the need for storms. So let's look at that in point 2, the need for storms. Storms are absolutely necessary, and that's why God allows them to happen. My sister and brother-in-law had this neurotic dog named Gandalf. And when I say neurotic, I mean, that's what I mean. I mean, he was supposed to be part of, they took in this tiny little puppy and they had to feed it just ground up like steak and stuff because he was going to be part of this program where he was going to be a helper dog. And so their job was to take care of him until he was old enough to go into training. They took him down to the training, and the training people said, nope. He washes out of his training program, and they have to keep him. Well, they don't have to, they do. It was a huge mistake. This dog is completely, it's anxious and nervous all the time. And so one time when they left to go someplace, they came home and found the screen from their second-story window on the ground, and they were looking at it when down the street came a jogger and their dog Gandalf running behind him. And the jogger said, "Is this your dog?" And they're like, "Yeah, what's he doing with you?" Or "What's she doing with you?" And the runner said, "I don't know. Just met me a few blocks back and started to follow me." And they realized that what had happened was this dog was so anxious when they left that he actually jumped out the second floor window of their house, landed in who knows what state, picked himself up and took off down the street, and first person that they found, they started to follow. But the worst thing about this dog was that every time there was a storm, every time there was thunder, the dog would just completely freak out and was completely inconsolable. Run around the house, tear things up. It was traumatized by these storms. So why do we, like this dog, when storms come, when things go wrong, why do we experience that kind of anxiety? I have a grandson named Mason, and Mason's a funny little kid. And he sees himself as a pretty sees himself as a pretty powerful 3-year-old. But there's one thing that he fears in his house, and that is the robotic vacuum cleaner. This is something that he's never liked. He tolerates it, he keeps an eye out for it, he makes sure it's not coming towards him. But the thing that he can never really seem to grasp or understand is that this is just part of what needs to go on in the house. This is not something to fear. It's something that his parents allow to take place because it's necessary. And it's really kind of silly to be afraid of. Now, he's starting to get over his fear, and part of that's because he has a sister now, and if the vacuum cleaner comes close, he'll actually cover up his sister and keep an eye out for the vacuum cleaner. But he doesn't understand that the vacuum cleaner, it's necessary. It's completely necessary. In the same way, storms are necessary. God uses storms. God allows storms. And if we trusted in God, then we would trust that storms are just a necessary part of what needs to happen in our world. I was reading about how storms are so, even hurricanes, are actually so beneficial to our environment. They're absolutely indispensable for our environment. One of the things that they do is in the ocean you get big algae blooms, and these storms actually break them up. These storms actually, one of the things that you'll see even in smaller storms as you go hiking, maybe if you hike down a riverbed, one of the things you'll notice is higher up out of the river, you'll see all kinds of logs and things strewn about for when a storm came and the waters rose. What happens is the storm waters, when they rise, they actually pick stuff up out of the lower parts of the canyon and raise it up so that the water now flows better. There's all kinds of things in our world. Our world is so complicated, it's really unimaginable to us how beneficial these storms are. If we trusted God, we would say, here comes something that needs to happen, And it's not something that I need to be afraid of. It's just a necessary part of the world. It's another sign of God's goodness. You see, when Mason gets older, he'll start to understand that the vacuum cleaner is just part of the goodness of his parents who want to keep his house clean. Storms, though, are also tests. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 22 and 23, it says, "On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then will I declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" How terrible would that be? To think in that moment that you knew God and to have Him say, "You never knew me." If only there was something, some kind of system or some kind of way that God had to warn us that we didn't really know Him. If only there was something that could have warned these people. And because God is merciful and good, there is such a system for warning us, and that system is called storms. When things go wrong in our lives, when the things are swirling around us, you know what those things are opportunities? They're opportunities for us to really test and see where we're at. I was talking this last week to somebody in our church who makes their living in education, and they talked about how their goal in tests is to really put the students to it, to really see where the students are. It's not to make something that the students could pass easily. It's to really find the limits and boundaries of their knowledge. Why? Because the students need to know that. The students need to know exactly where the boundaries are, where they're strong and where they're weak, what they can handle easily and what they're going to struggle with. They need to know that. And he says he asks the questions in as many ways as possible, not trying to trip them up, but trying to test those limits of the boundaries, because his tests are not the ultimate tests. These students are all going to take an entrance exam, and they better be ready. They better know their stuff. And so his job is to find out the limits of that. You know, that's what God does all the time for us. He sends us things that are outside of our control. He sends us things that aren't going the way that we would prefer. He sends us things that are a real struggle for us. Why? Because ultimately we need to know who our God is. We need to know, do we really trust in God or do we not trust in God? We have this amazing capacity for self-deception. To think that things are the way that they're not. My little grandson Mason at 3 years old thinks he's very strong. But so many things in the world don't yield to his strength. And God's using that world to help him to see where his strength really lies. And in the same way, God sends these storms as necessary things for us to see, is our trust really in Him? Is He really our God? The third thing we need to see is the path of peace. So many times what the self-deception that we end up involved in looks like is it looks like sin. You see, the self-deception in our life ends up looking like sin. What happens is we think that God is our God, but in reality we trust in other things. And the world is frightening to us. And so to deal with that lack of trust in God, we end up engaging in things that we shouldn't be engaged in. And we do that to distract us over the problems that we have that rise out of our lack of confidence in God. Our sin is often a way of escaping our anxiety over these storms. We have the external storms and threats. We have loss of jobs, loss of health, loss of friends. We have our anxiety over the world and politics and all of those things. But we also deal with the internal storms of not liking who we are, and we turn to drugs and alcohol and pornography and rage, and slander. You know, it's interesting that so many of the sins that we experience all the time, you can trace back to a way of propping ourselves up and not dealing with the anxiety of a lack of trust in God. One of the things that I find really interesting here is that Jesus says, take heart. Jesus is, in this passage in John chapter 16, verse 33, is explaining to the disciples that he's leaving and they're going to experience hardship, but he says, take heart. But he doesn't say what I would want him to say. I want Jesus to say, but take heart. You're not going to have to go through all these things. It's going to be easy for you. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great if Jesus said, hey, you know what? The world looks scary and everything, but take heart, because it really isn't scary. The world looks scary and everything, but take heart, because I'm going to get you out of this. The world is scary. You have this big test coming up, but take heart, because I'm giving you a free pass and you don't even have to take the test. That's not what Jesus says. He says, take heart. I have overcome the world. Now, the thing is, on its surface, that doesn't seem to alleviate the problems, does it? If you had a friend and your friend said, man, I went and I took this test, and it was the hardest test I've ever taken, and you're going to have to take it too, but take heart because I got an A. You'd say, so? What is that? You just threw off the curb. We're grading on a curve, I think, and you just messed it up. You got 100%. Now, what are we going to do? You know, it doesn't seem to on its surface to help us. And that's what Jesus says, take heart, I have overcome the world. It's not completely obvious what that has to do with our problems. Jesus has overcome the world. You know what I think at least part of the answer to that is? You see, the problem is that we make the world our God. We say the storm is here and I'm afraid that's now my God. The war is here and I'm afraid that's now my God. The financial collapse is now here and I'm afraid because that's my God. And what that reveals is that we're not where we should be. You see, when God made us, He made us to be kings of the earth. He made us to be over creation. The way that it should have worked is it was God and then us and then all of creation. But if we're afraid of creation, then that means it's not that way at all. It's God and then creation and then us. Like we're at the mercy and whim of everything around us. I remember when I was a kid, I think I might have told you this story, but my friend had a big dog, a big German Shepherd, and when we would go, he had this cool playhouse that I always wanted. I always liked to play, and it was like a tree house. It was up in the sky, and it had all kind of furniture and stuff in it. And I always thought it was great. But the problem is that to get to that tree house, you had to go through his yard, and he had this massive dog. And he would say, "Hey, the dog's no problem. Just when it runs at you, just curl up in a ball. Get on the ground and curl up in a ball, and then he'll leave you alone." Wait, what? What? In my mind, if I'm stopped and small, this dog's going to eat me. He can now bite any part of me he wants to. It seemed like the worst thing ever. And basically, the thing was, submit to the dog and he'll run away. And that seems to be what we do, right? We submit to the world hoping that it runs away. I remember going on a mission trip to Thailand, and their view was that everything has spirits in it. And you would make these spirit houses. In fact, a lot of times you'd go into a village and they'd have one for the whole village, and they would put all kinds of valuable things in this. And they would wear these strings. They were called spirit strings. And what these strings did was they showed the spirits that were around them, "Hey, I'm submitting to you. Don't hurt me." And again, we think, well, they're just kind of naive. No, they're not. They're acting out what we do internally. But Jesus is saying, I've overcome the world. What does he mean by that? He means that he trusted in God, and this world was not his God. Jesus trusted in God. He knew that his life was in the hands of his Father. Jesus trusted in the Father for his future. He knew that even in death, the Father could be trusted. And the death of Jesus on the cross ended up being the pathway for us to have a restored relationship with God, and ended up raising up Jesus to the right hand where everything was placed under his feet. You see, the Father could be trusted even in death. Jesus has overcome the world, even physical death. We're supposed to reign over that, but we're all afraid of it. But Jesus has said, I'm not afraid of it. I trust in the Father. And so now if we are in Christ, we have that same reign and rule. We have that same Spirit. And in fact, what's really interesting is if you look further back in the book of John, in the chapter of John 16, let's go all the way back to John 16, verse 12 through 15. It's really interesting what Jesus does here. He says, I still have many things to say, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, for he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. Therefore, I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. What Jesus is saying is, look, you need me to leave because the Spirit's going to come. And when the Spirit's going to come, he's going to take everything of mine and give it to you, just like the Father took everything of his and gave it to me. You need the Spirit. You see, the thing is, if we have the same Spirit as Christ, then we have overcome the world as well. If you trust in the Father the way Jesus did, then you overcome the world also. How do you have the Spirit in you then? How do we live in the Spirit? Well, there's a lot of ways, and we cover those things every week, but let me just give you one right now. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. You know, one of the interesting things here is it doesn't say that you're going to be given anything that you want. The storm might be coming, and you might pray to God and say, God, you know, I really wish the storm would pass. Remember that Jesus was in the garden, and he said, hey, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. But then he said, but not my will, but yours be done. What is it that praying with supplication and thanksgiving does for us? It reminds us who our God is. You see, when the storm's coming and you pray to God, and you pray not only with supplication, but also with thanksgiving, you're reminding yourself who really is in control, who is really God. And when you pray with thanksgiving, you're setting yourself up to trust that no matter what the answer from God is, whether the storm passes around you or whether it hits you full force, you can trust that God is doing it for your good, that God is allowing you to experience this, and there are good things that can come from it, that the storm is not something to be afraid of. It's just the part of creation that God uses for his purposes like everything else. You see, in the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts. When the storm comes, the question is, will you have peace in it? Or will you be afraid? Living in fear is a terrible thing. And over a long period of time, it can do terrible things to you, mentally and physically and emotionally. In fact, it's not too much to say that living in fear can absolutely destroy you. But there is nothing that can ever happen to us on this earth that God is not in control of. And there is nothing that can't be transformed into a blessing for us when we have faith and trust in Him. Believe that Christ has overcome the world. Belong to Jesus and be found in Him, and become by having His Spirit through prayer. We have this opportunity this holiday season to not let the storm around us affect our joy. Take that opportunity to trust in Him.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.